Today we're looking at the Dred Scott case. Hello, welcome to the Daily Bellringer. Please don't forget to subscribe and take a look at the questions down in the description. Also, don't forget to check out dailybellringer.com where you'll find resources that go with many of the Bellringer videos. The Dred Scott case is one of the most divisive and misguided decisions ever made by the U.S. Supreme Court, and it played a major role in leading the nation toward the Civil War. Today, I'm standing here in St. Louis, Missouri, inside the old courthouse where the original case was heard. Dred Scott was an African-American man born into slavery in 1799 in Southampton County, Virginia. By 1830, he had moved to St. Louis, Missouri with his slave owner, a man named Peter Blow, who died in 1832. After Peter Blow's death, Dred Scott was purchased by an Army surgeon named Dr. John Emerson in St. Louis, Missouri. Emerson was then assigned to Fort Armstrong in Rock Island, Illinois, and he brought Dred Scott with him. While there, Scott met another enslaved person named Harriet, and they were married. Both Dred and Harriet Scott now belonged to John Emerson. From there, Emerson was assigned to Fort Snelling in Wisconsin Territory, and he took both Dred and Harriet with him. Now, you might be asking yourself, how could Emerson bring enslaved people into free territory? Illinois was a free state, and slavery was illegal in Wisconsin. At the time, many people simply turned a blind eye. Many Northerners opposed slavery for economic reasons rather than moral ones, so often they didn't report it or just turned a blind eye to it. In 1843, Dr. Emerson died suddenly at the age of 40, and the ownership of the Scotts transferred to his widow, Irene Emerson, in St. Louis. In 1846, Dred and Harriet Scott sued Irene Emerson for their freedom in the Missouri courts. There was a Missouri law stating that if a slave lived in a free state or territory, they could not be returned to slavery. Lawsuits were expensive, and the Scotts did not have much money. So they were supported by their church, abolitionist groups in St. Louis, and surprisingly, the Blow family, the family of Peter Blow, who was Scott's original owner, that brought him to St. Louis. In 1850, the Missouri court ruled in favor of the Scotts and declared them free. However, Irene Emerson appealed the decision, and the Missouri Supreme Court reversed it, placing the Scotts back into slavery. By 1853, Irene had transferred ownership of the Scotts to her brother, John Sanford, although she still technically owned them. That same year, Dred Scott filed another lawsuit, this time in the U.S. federal court. The case became known as Dred Scott versus Sanford. The federal court ruled against Scott, but he appealed again, and the case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. By this point, the case had become national news because the Supreme Court had never made a major ruling on slavery. At the time, many Supreme Court justices were from the South and supported slavery, including Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, who delivered the official decision of the U.S. Supreme Court on March 6th of 1857. The court ruled that Dred Scott had no right to sue because he was considered property, not a citizen of the United States. Therefore, he had no legal standing in the court. The court went even further, declaring that enslaved people were property protected by the Constitution. This meant that banning slavery in any territory was unconstitutional. In effect, the ruling struck down the Missouri Compromise and suggested that laws restricting slavery were invalid. This decision shocked the nation. Many people were outraged that the Supreme Court had declared limits on slavery unconstitutional. It's important to remember that just because the Supreme Court makes a decision does not mean it is correct. And this is a clear example of that. At the time of the decision, violence was beginning to break out in Bleeding, Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups were clashing over the possible expansion of slavery into the territory. The president at the time, James Buchanan, supported the Supreme Court's decision, believing it was constitutional and protected the rights of slave owners. This added to the growing national tension. On a more positive note, by the time the decision was handed down, Irene Emerson had remarried a man named Calvin Chaffee, a U.S. congressman and an abolitionist. When he realized that Irene still owned Dred and Harriet Scott, he arranged for them to be sold to Henry Taylor Blow, the son of Peter Blow. Henry Taylor Blow immediately set them free on May 26th of 1857. The Scotts lived in St. Louis for a short time after gaining their freedom, but sadly Dred Scott died in 1858 at the age of 59 from tuberculosis. Today, Dred Scott's legacy endures as a powerful symbol of the struggle for freedom and a case that heavily contributed to the growing divide in a nation heading for civil war. So with that, hopefully you learned something, and thanks for watching.